righteous anger. When we are faced with injustice. There was once a woman, and probably you know of her. Her name was Emily Post. And she was born sometime in the early 1870s and died in 1960. What made Emily famous was a book that she wrote called Etiquette. And this book, which ran through some 10 editions at the publishing house that handled her book, taught people how to get along politely in society. And some of what she said was good. For example, how many of us have ever been to a restaurant, one of those posh restaurants, and somehow you have seen, or some of us might have been confused by the array of knives and forks and spoons that are placed on the table. And we do not have a clue which one to use first. So, Emily suggests that maybe what you should do with the knives and forks that you see there, if you don't know really what to do, just look at the person beside you, look at your neighbor, and see what they're doing. And you do the same. Or, Emily said, manners are a sensitive awareness of the feelings of others. If you have that awareness, you have good manners, no matter which fork you use. However, she also wrote, to do exactly as your neighbor do is the only sensible rule. We would hope that your neighbor knows what to do. And someone else said this in another way. When in Rome, do as the Romans do. Now, I don't know about you, but that doesn't necessarily seem very wise advice to me. Nor, in fact, does it sound very Jesus-like. But isn't it the case that over the years, centuries even, the church has given us a picture of Jesus who is quite reserved, Jesus who is quiet, Jesus who is calm, Jesus who is mild. The Jesus who is so meek and mild that it's difficult to image anyone getting so angry at him as to want to kill him. But the picture of Jesus as meek and mild. I remember as a child, before you would go to bed, you had to say this little prayer. Gentle Jesus, look upon, pity my. Oh, you got that one right. Suffer me to come to thee. So we grew up with this image of Jesus being meek and mild. We grew up with this image of Jesus who speaks in hushed tones. We grew up with this image of Jesus who cannot kill an ant or a mosquito. We grew up with this image of Jesus that he's so pious and all of that. Why would anybody want to kill him? Well, come later on in this month, we're going to be celebrating and we're going to be remembering his death, burial, and resurrection. Why would anybody want to kill Jesus? Why would anybody want to kill this meek and mild gentleman? Why would anybody look at this man who has fed people and healed the sick, raised the dead? Why would somebody want to kill him? But the picture of Jesus as being meek and mild is only half the picture of Jesus. As we hear in our gospel reading today, there is another side to Jesus that we need to grapple with. Here we have a picture of Jesus we don't see very often. It's the angry Jesus. It is the loud Jesus. It is the Jesus who is not meek and mild. And let me set the scene for you. It is Passover time. And that's the holiday celebrated, reminding the people of God's deliverance from slavery in the land of Egypt and of God's fierce judgment passing over the homes of God's people that had been marked with the blood of the sacrificial lamb. It's a time of unleavened bread, lamb and herbs. They didn't eat pork in those days. It's a time of sacrificial lambs and privileges and pilgrimage to the temple in Jerusalem to offer prayers to God. But it is more than evident that the sight that greets Jesus there that day, as he and the disciples arrive to prepare to observe Passover, the sight that he saw in the temple angers him greatly. Verse 14 says that in the temple courts, Jesus finds there traders. In the temple courts, there were people selling cattle. There were people selling sheep. There were people selling doves, and others setting tables and sitting at tables, exchanging money. The church, the outer court where the Gentiles would worship, had become a place of trading. It had become a place of commerce. It had become a marketplace. The word court means the outer courtyards of the temple rather than the inner sanctum of the temple, so to speak. In fact, and importantly so, for our understanding of this gospel story, the temple courts was the place reserved for the Gentiles to worship. Remember, the Jews and the Gentiles couldn't worship together. The Jews were in the inner sanctum and the Gentiles were in the outer courts. That's where they would worship. But we read that in the place of the Gentiles, that is the non-Jews who nevertheless wanted to worship God but had not gone through the rituals of becoming Jews, the space reserved for them to worship had been taken away with a whole variety of stalls selling all kinds of commodities, especially related to the Passover ritual of sacrifice. And those changing money occupied that space. So you see what is happening? Here was a space for people to worship, but because of the rituals, because of the Passover celebration, those who were financially minded, they took over that space. So as a result of that, the people could not worship. So here was a situation where Jews and non-Jews alike came from foreign lands far away, and they needed to exchange their coin into the temple treasury. After all, on their coins, if they lived within the Roman Empire, it bore the image of Caesar. And it would be next to blasphemous to offer these to God. In addition to changing their money, they would need to buy animals for sacrifice. I guess that none of this was bad in itself, because guess what? You needed a sacrifice. So if you're coming from far, it would be kind of tedious to walk with a goat. It would be kind of tedious to walk with a lamb. And if you travel like me heavy, they would charge you a little more. Thank God for Cayman Airways 55 pounds. If you were traveling heavy and carrying a ram, it would be quite a challenge. So the easiest thing for them to do was to go to the place where at the temple and to buy a pigeon, buy a lamb, buy something that would allow you to offer a sacrifice. I guess that none of this was bad in itself. To an extent, the traders were providing an essential service to those who desired to make themselves right. Because when you come to the temple, and offer your sacrifice, you are making sure that you were right with God. But on the other hand, the traders were so many and took up so much space, they were making it impossible for the Gentiles to worship God. What had begun with the intention of providing a service had in fact now become a disservice. And Jesus sees that. Jesus sees them preventing the people from worshiping the true and living God. There's probably more to it as well. It is probable that the money changers were including a very hefty, exorbitant even, exchange rate for their service. So if you could get a pigeon for $10, they were saying, "Hey, it's the temple, $15. It all smacks of all of these traders making a large profit from the religious needs of the faithful. So in this righteous anger, Jesus is acting against the double injustice that is, firstly, preventing the non-Jewish people from worshiping God. Secondly, Jesus was seeing to attack the people who were cheating the worshipers by charging unfair exchange rates. In Jesus' words and in his actions, he's angry. Jesus is rebelling against unjust practices that are preventing people getting close to God in worship. Is it the case then that God calls us as Christians today to rebel? Is it that God is calling us as his representatives to rebel too? Is it that God calls us to do the opposite? When in Rome, do as the Romans do? What would Jesus do? When we are faced with injustice, when we are faced with situations that cause people not to be who they really ought to be or who God intended them to be, we need to ask ourselves as Christians in this day and age, what would Jesus do? Our gospel reading today shows us that sometimes Jesus went against the grain. Sometimes Jesus went against the grain. Sometimes Jesus stood up for and spoke out against unfair practices. He stood up and spoke out against unfair practices, attitudes of his day. If something was not going right, Jesus would speak out against it. Sometimes Jesus was a rebel. I know it's a hard word this morning, but we need to hear it. Now, perhaps we don't hear this idea very often or not often enough. The word rebel usually carries a negative connotation with it. Rebelling against society, rebelling against parents, rebelling against God is usually what happens as we lump all these together and say that rebelling is generally a bad thing. Well, let's think about it for a moment. Is it possible to be a rebel and to be a Christian? Is it possible to be a rebel and to be a Christian? That's a question. And it seems that the answer to that question is yes. It seems that we can and should follow Jesus. Remember, what would Jesus do? We should rebel against unfair aspects of society and world affairs. We must rebel against unfair systems within the church. We must rebel against systems that make us not worship the God whom we have called to worship. Just look at the prophets of old. They spoke out in general terms and at personal risk against injustice in their lives and at the time that they were living. Just look at Jesus in the temple that day. He was considered to be rebelling, acting and speaking out against the unfair and unjust practices associated with his religion in his time. Practices that prevented so many people from drawing close to God in worship so that many people would have that relationship with God that he requires. Jesus rebelled against preventing people from worshiping God. He wasn't saying that the whole religious system was wrong and had to be thrown out. He wasn't saying that. He was saying that there are flaws and there are problems in how people are providing services associated with it. We have to watch our society. We have to watch our church and make sure that we're not doing things that will prevent people from worshiping the true and living God. And let's talk truth. Sometimes within the church, our actions and the things that we do and say prevent people from worshiping God. There needs to be a rebellion in terms of what the church does and what we do to prevent people from experiencing God in all his fullness. So sometimes as Christians, we are called to rebel. I don't mean rebel against God. I mean rebel against injustice. Injustice in society, injustice in the church. We need to rebel against what is wrong, ungodly. Sometimes I believe that God calls us to rebel against the way that everyone else has got used to doing things. Sometimes we're so caught up with doing some things, and when we check it out, it is not bringing honor and glory to God. It is preventing others from serving God. We need to rebel against that. Sometimes I believe that we as Christians, as Christian people, we are called to rebel against what others believe to be right. And when you check it out, it is not right. So, let's not do something just because it seems like everyone else is doing it. I call upon the Christians today in this society and around the world not to become passive. Let us not passively, when in Rome, do as the Romans do. If we believe that there is a better way, a more just and fair way, a more Christian-like way, let us endeavor to do what God would want us to do. Remember, what would Jesus do? So I believe that there will be times when what we feel God is leading us to do will be different from others around us who are advocating and doing things. That's okay. Yes, it can be scary when we discern God's calling us to rebel, to go against the flow. But it's what God is calling us to do. and we need to do it. It might look like rebellion to others, especially those who want to keep things as they are. You know, you have some people like that. They don't want to upset the apple cart. We have been doing this from ever since. From the church was built, we have been doing this. We have been sitting here. We have been doing this and doing that. Why would you think you need to change? You know what I like about our church? Our United Church is a reformed church, a church that is constantly being reformed and experiencing new ways of worshiping God and doing what God has called us to do. Maybe what we need in the church and in society today is a rebellion. Maybe it is a rebellion that we need, but it ought to be a good rebellion. It is a rebellion that speaks to the obedience to God's will and God's way. It is a rebellion that ought to be Christ-like. It's like John the Baptist. It's like Elijah and the other prophets of God. It is like all the disciples who would not toe the party line. It's being a rebel with a cause, God's holy cause. Finally, J.B. Phillips, who made his own translation of the Bible, also wrote, among others, a book called Your God is Too Small. In it, he comments on a line of a verse of the Christmas carol, Once in Royal David City. The line that says, Christian children all must be mild, obedient, good as he. This is what he writes about that line. The word mild is apparently deliberately used to describe Jesus, a man who did not hesitate to challenge and expose the hypocrites of the religious people of his day. A man who was regarded by the authorities as a public danger, public enemy number one. A man who could be moved to violent anger by shameless exploitation or by complacency. Here it speaks about a man of such courage that he deliberately walked to what he knew would mean death, despite the earnest pleas for well-meaning friends. Mild, he says, what a word to use about Jesus. J.B. Phillips exclaimed, Jesus might be called meek, he says, in the sense of being utterly devoted to what he considered right, whatever the personal cost. But mild, Jesus was never mild. So, my brothers and sisters, today, we do not always have to be mild. No, do not misunderstand me. I don't want anybody starting any fights and quarrels after church. We do not always have to be mild. We do not always have to fit in. And that's a problem with our church, you know. Not only my church, but most churches today. We want people to come and fit in. How we look, how we feel, how we speak. But Jesus says, come just as you are. Many times in the church, we want to scale the fish, fry the fish, before we even catch the fish. We want people to look like us, but hey, when you came to Jesus, you did not look like us. You were all in sin. And some of us have to say that we were in the gutter of sin, but Jesus took us out. And sometimes when people come to our churches and they don't look like us, they don't smell like us, they don't sing like us, we reject them. He's saying, church is not for the fit-in people. Church is a place where we come to be redeemed. Church is a place where we come to experience God in a new way, just as we are. We do not always have to fit in. We do not always have to do what our neighbors are doing. As Emily Post suggested, do not always watch your neighbor. As long as it is God that is leading you, we do whatever we have to do to follow God's will. We can be rebellious as long as the end result is to be more Christ-like. To co-create with God the kingdom of justice and peace, the kingdom of joy in all its fullness here on earth. Christ calls us to be rebels with a holy cause. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Let us pray. Your words, O God, have challenged us today not to be complacent Christians, not to live in a world where things are happening around us and not respond, not to live in a world of injustice and lack of peace and we are silent. Your word has challenged us today, God, that as Christians in your church, we ought to be ever reforming. Not to go with the flow. Because sometimes the flow is going in the wrong direction. But help us, God, to turn our eyes upon you, to look full in your wonderful face. And then the things of this earth, the injustices and the immoral practices will grow strangely dim in the light of your glory and grace. Help us, God, when things are crumbling around us as Christians, to rise up and to heed the call to be the voice that will heal, that will change direction. But many times, God, because of our compromising ways, we cannot stand. We cannot rebel. Because many times, God, we are in the back pockets of those who are in authority, whether in society or in the church. So we cannot speak out for you. But God, I pray that you'll free us, give us free minds and hearts to stand and to make our voices heard as your people, as rebels with a cause. Father, even as we approach you today, remember those of our numbers who are not well. Especially, Father, remember Janice at this time. We pray, Almighty God, that you will visit with her now. And Cause her, even at this moment, to recognize that your people are in prayer for her. I pray, God, that you will cause her to realize, even at this moment, that your presence, your divine presence, is with her. Comfort her, God. Hold her close to you. Cause her to find that peace and rest which only comes from you. We present to you, God, our respective needs. You know them. You know our heart's desires. You know the struggles that we are facing right now individually. We ask you, God, by your will and your grace, to intervene and cause that your will might be done. Hear our prayers now, we ask.